Well, good afternoon. This is Doug Green. I'm Chair of Venable's Environmental and Natural Resources Practice Group, and welcome to our post-election webinar series. We're delighted you can join us today, and it's been an interesting couple of weeks. And after a bit of a wait, I think it's safe to say we have a new administration with President-elect Biden leading the way. And with that, we will be seeing some important changes in national environmental policy. And this afternoon, we're going to discuss some of those changes with you, and I have some of my colleagues from our Legislative and Government Affairs group who have their fingers on the pulse of Congress to discuss some of those changes with you. And we have today with us the Honorable Bart Stupak, who served 18 years in the U.S. Congress. Bart is being joined by Will Nordwin, who's co-chair of our Legislative and Government Affairs practice, and Will is also a 15-year veteran of Capitol Hill. Nick Choate, another veteran of Capitol Hill, is joining us. Nick served, among other things, as the Deputy Legislative Director for former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill from Missouri. And we also have Mike Bloomquist, who recently joined us, and prior to coming to Venable was Staff Director and Chief Counsel to the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So we have a distinguished group of experts on Congress and where we think the new administration may be heading with respect to environmental policy. But before we get into that, Will is going to give us an overview of where the 2020 election came out. And Will, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Doug, and welcome to everybody. I'm going to go very quickly over this first slide because I think most of you on the phone have probably been following with great interest as we have the results. At the top, depending on which outlet you're following, I would say President-elect Biden has anywhere between 279 electoral votes. The Associated Press, which some would consider the gold standard, has him at 290. But regardless, I think it's fair to say he has all the major outlets have declared him President-elect Biden. Of course, there are two states where President Trump has not yet conceded, as you all probably know. Georgia and North Carolina remain undecided. Georgia is going to be doing a recount. There is some litigation, as you all probably are well aware, that the president has filed, especially in Pennsylvania, where President Trump is seeking to prohibit Pennsylvania from certifying the election. But again, the reason why we're here today is because of the declaration of President-elect Biden's winning this election. And with that, I will turn it over to Nick Choate.
Thanks, Will. Okay, there's the slide. So the presidential race, folks have obviously seen in the news, less reported some of the Senate races. We now have all but two of the Senate races called. The two races in Georgia are both going to runoffs in January, on January 5th, to determine ultimate control of the Senate. As it stands right now in January, the Senate will be 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats, with the two races in Georgia undecided. As things stand, Democrats picked up a net of one seat by winning the seats in Colorado and Arizona against incumbent Republicans. Republicans picked up the Doug Jones-held seat in Alabama. One thing that is not on that slide there that I just want to flag that is particularly relevant in the Senate is a couple of key leadership changes in the environmental space. Whether Republicans are in the majority or the minority, we're likely to see the top Republicans at both the Environment and Public Works Committee as well as the Energy and Natural Resources Committee change. Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska is term limited as chairman of Energy and Natural Resources, and Senator Barrasso from Wyoming is expected to replace her there, which frees up his chairmanship at Environment and Public Works, likely to be replaced by West Virginia Senator Shelley Moore Capito there. Again, those changes would happen in either scenario, whether Republicans hold the Senate majority by winning at least one of the Georgia specials, or even if they end up in the minority, either way. And on that, I think I am now going to kick it to my colleague, Congressman Stupak.
Thanks, Nick. And if we look at the 2020 election and what does the next 60 days holds for our country, first, we know the election fight is going to continue. I do not expect President Trump to throw in the towel. I think he's going to continue to fight this election. And he can fight through recertifications and canvassing through the states. But by December 14th, each state should meet and do their electoral college electors, as they call them. And that would be December 14th. And each state then sends the results to Congress, and they must receive it by December 23rd. So I really think it's going to take till at least December 14th before President Trump concedes this presidency. So Congress then comes in, the 117th Congress comes in probably on January 3rd or 4th, and on January 6th, the new Congress, the 117th Congress, actually certifies the election results on January 6th. So as Nick said, we still have Georgia runoff elections. That's going to be on January 5th. And very interesting, a lot of pundits are saying they're going to be spending up to about $500 million on these two races in Georgia, which is insane, but that's where we're at right now. And then the government, of course, before the election, they did a continuing budget resolution, as we call it, to continue funding the government. And that's only till December 11th. So that CR runs out. And Nick, you might want to speak a little bit more on what will happen with the funding. Will the COVID bill get finished? Are we going to have just a continuing resolution, or do you think there's an omnibus bill? So Nick, why don't you touch on that for me for a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. Certainly in the upcoming lame duck session, which I guess technically started this week with the Senate being back in session. Obviously, government funding is in play, as Bart mentioned. Everyone is still talking about a COVID package. Whether that gets done before the new Congress and the new administration, very much a question mark. And then the National Defense Authorization Act is the other big ticket item in the lame duck session. As things stand right now, senior leadership in both chambers of both parties would like to wrap up these spending bills and pass what they call an omnibus bill, basically one bill containing everything to fund the government through next September, as opposed to just continuing to kick the can down the road with another continuing resolution. There are obviously some very sticky policy and funding issues involved there that could hold that up, but at this point that seems to be where folks want to head. I would flag, for instance, the border wall is still a point of contention between the chambers and the White House. On COVID, we are still seeing the Senate and the House quite a ways apart. I think we're going to continue to see the parties talk to each other, but the smart money at this point seems to be on COVID happening in January with the new Congress and the new administration. The big question mark with everything between now and January 20th, however, and I think my colleagues of both parties would agree on this, there is a big question mark as to what, if anything, President Trump is going to be willing to sign into law in this post-election environment. No one is seriously talking about a government shutdown right now, but I suspect we will start to see more chatter about that as we get closer to December 11th. Bart, did I miss anything there that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. And I think it's fair to say now that not fair to say, but the House is actually scheduled to go back on Monday. But at least in the U.S. House of Representatives, the people who are elected to the 117th Congress, they'll be electing their House party leadership. So when the 117th Congress takes over in January 3rd or 4th or 5th, whenever they're going to first day of session, the Democrats have lost seats. So it's going to be a thin margin in the U.S. House. Right now, that's 218, 202, 218 Democrats. That's the exact number you need to pass anything, because it's a simple majority in House of Representatives. But there's 15 seats remaining, and it's expected of those 15 seats, the Democrats might pick up half of them, Republicans the other half. So it's going to be a real slim margin in the U.S. House of Representatives. So the election of House leadership on both Democrats and Republicans next week will be pretty interesting. There's a little turmoil in the Democratic Party because they did lose seats in the seat when they won the presidency. Usually a president has coattails. Here there was no coattails by Joe Biden to any House seats. In fact, they lost seats. So the head of the DCCC, the Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee, was Sherry Butos of Illinois. She resigned. So there's a fight going on right there to see who's going to succeed Sherry Butos as DCCC, Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee, and that's the political arm of the Democratic Party. Right now, Tony Cardenas from California. Tony's from California. He's announced. Sean Patrick Maloney of upstate, over by Massachusetts there. He's running, and so is Mark Vesey out of Texas. So that's going to be an interesting race there. And within the party, the progressive wing is blaming the moderate Democrats. Moderates are blaming the liberals for their policies. So all is well in the Democratic Party, as Will Rogers used to say. I don't belong to an organized party. I'm a Democrat. So they're going to have a little interesting times next week for leadership. Going under House chairs, they stayed the same except appropriations. As you know, Nita Lowey retired. So we have three of them vying for the chair. Marcy Kaptur, who's considered more of a moderate, Rosa DeLauro, who's considered a progressive, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, who's also considered a progressive. So it'll be very interesting to see how that breaks out there for House appropriations. Richie Neal will stay as Ways and Means, Frank Pallone, Energy and Commerce Committee, and Maxine Waters, Financial Services. The Senate stays the same. I think, Nick, you highlighted the changes there, but appropriations will still be Shelby. Senate Finance will be Senator Mike Crapo in Idaho, and Roger Wicker will be Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania will be Senate Banking. So you can see there's still, not just with the presidency, but also with the U.S. House, some uncertainty here. But let me turn it back to our partner in charge of our environmental group, that'd be Doug Green. And Doug, you want to take it from there?
Sure, thanks. So that's the political landscape, but what does this mean for environmental regulation and policy? And with that, our partner Mike Bloomquist is going to go over what might we have seen in the Trump administration and what are we likely to see in a Biden administration, and the contrast is pretty stark. Mike, you want to take it over?
Thanks, Doug. As you can see from the slide that, it was going to be pretty much business as usual for the Trump administration. They were going to continue to selectively alter or promulgate rules to, in their view, streamline and cut red tape. They would continue a litigation strategy, which was not always in the posture of vigorously defending Obama-era regulations. And they would, if Democrats were in control of the House and Senate, they would continue to be a block on environmental legislation moving forward. The Biden administration is also facing divided government, so I think we're going to not see a Green New Deal. We're probably not going to see a public law coming from a massive climate change bill. The House will still act aggressively, as Bart Stupak just said. There's a lot of tension within the party. There's going to be a lot of pressure from the progressive base. So I think you will see the House act on the Hill. We call those messaging bills in an effort to call attention to issues and highlight the fact that, but for Republican obstructionism, this type of legislation would pass. On the administrative side of the House, you will immediately see a freeze on day one, which is traditional with every administration. where a memo goes forth from the office of the president, the executive office of the president, and it says, pencils down, no more work on any regulations, anything that is not final gets frozen in place, and then the administration and their political appointees will then review the state of play for those regulations and decide what may proceed and what do they just want to have wither. So what you're seeing between now and January 20th is a Trump administration, as an administrative matter, proceeding furiously to try to finalize regulations where they can. It'd also be interesting to see the what the posture is of the Biden administration in court. They're may take a cue from the Trump administration and switch sides in some cases. They may provide tepid defenses in some cases, or they may decide not to defend certain regulations that are being challenged. So I think there's a lot of activity will happen in the regulatory realm where the administration's just signed. Can they alter things on their own? Can they provide guidance to narrowly tailor things they think are have gone too far? Or do they have to go through the whole APA rulemaking process and repromulgate regulations? So with that, I will turn to Bart for the Vice President's plan.
Thanks, Mike. Well, Vice President Biden ran on a very aggressive plan throughout the campaign, and it's interesting to note, having been in Congress there for 18 years, in 2009, last time anybody passed a climate change bill was in 2009. It was like probably March of 2009. The House of Representatives passed, back then they were calling it climate change. And we passed it by one vote, came out of the Energy and Commerce Committee where I sat, came and passed by one vote. And then even before that vote occurred, the Senate stated they were not going to take up the bill. But House leadership still made us walk the line, and we ended up passing climate change by one vote. So it'll be very, very interesting to see if Mitch McConnell goes back on and do the same tactic as the House, and the House will put forth a bill. There's no doubt about it. It won't be the new Green Deal, but they'll put forth legislation. And if McConnell is the majority leader, will he simply say, well, that's fine, House, do what you want, we're not going to take it up. The difference you see is even in the title of the bills. In 2009, we called it climate change. Now they're calling it global climate crisis of 2021. And what does that mean on a practical point? Well, you have John Tester from up in Montana, senator up there, who says, obviously things have changed since 2009, and yes, we have to do something. And he's one of the more conservative members of the Senate on the Democratic side. And probably the most conservative Democrat is Joe Manchin, and Joe just recently said, Senator Manchin from West Virginia just recently said, well, let's see it. The devils are in the details. So as we look at the Biden plan and look at the details, take a look at re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. That's a no-brainer. The president's going to do it. He'll do that, and plus he'll join the World Health Organization. And as the president-elect, Biden has been receiving calls from overseas, from presidents and premiers from other countries. They congratulate him, and they welcome the idea that we're going to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. Use of executive order, roll back Trump administration environmental standards. Remember the CAFE standards were rolled back. Some parts of the Clean Air Act were rolled back. What he can do by executive order, he will aggressively do. The next two, end planet warming pollution from electricity by 2035. That's his starting position. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to hold that line. And even the part where it says 100% clean energy and net zero emissions by 2025, extremely difficult, especially if we do not, if the Senate is in Republican hands. And we got that Georgia seats. They got to win both Georgia seats. I could see the Democrats winning one, but not two. So it'll be 51-49. And as we've seen with the Supreme Court nominee, he certainly is going to hold the line. McConnell will certainly hold the line with his Senate Republicans. But if we take a little closer at the $2 trillion that President-elect Biden campaigned on and remains on his website, it's going to be broken up into different parts. It's just not going to be one big bill. The coronavirus stimulus package, there will be another one after the start of this year, after we get into 2021. And that's what they did remember when Obama came in 2009, President Obama came in, our economy was in rough shape. We did the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Well, but just about $1 out of every $10 there was for environmental laws and clean energy and infrastructure. So don't be surprised if we find a large amount of money hidden in a interior bill, or it'll be hidden around. And when you see the next parts, like he's talking about 500,000 electric charging stations for vehicles and 1.5 million energy-efficient homes. That'll be in transportation infrastructure bill. Mandate to purchase hybrid and electric vehicles. That can probably be done through executive order. It'll be the policy of this administration. Carbon capture and sequestration. We haven't heard much about it because remember the cap and trade bill we did in 2009. I call it climate change. It was also cap and trade. That was a carbon tax was found in there. So I could see something like that coming out of Ways and Means, and maybe even part of it in a transportation bill. Farm equipment, that'll be found in the ag bill. Environment and climate justice for pollutants in communities of color and tribal lands, that is definitely going to go. You know, I said that, can McConnell hold the line, and I think that's going to be the real key. I still see Republican senators like maybe Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, Lisa Murkowski, depending on what she can get for Alaska and the oil industry. I can see Collins up in Maine. I can see Ben Sassa, Nebraska. There's a couple I could see come over on climate. Climate has changed. The political attitude has changed, and so has the practical legislative look at climate change. There's no doubt something has to be done. It has to be done now. But it won't be as extensive as the Democrats like, which will get the progressive wing of the Democratic Party out of the House very upset and probably cause more problems between the House and the Senate. But realistically, I think you're going to have a very much watered down New Green Deal. We're not going to do a New Green Deal. Just no getting around there. After that, I think, and Mike, I'm not sure if you or Doug are going to talk about the Congressional Review Act primer. That's a very interesting piece of legislation, and they have to be careful how they do it. But why don't you take it, Mike? Why don't you take Congressional Review Act?
Thanks, Bart. So the Congressional Review Act is a statute that is it's a very powerful tool for Congress to be able to undo final regulations by an administration. Prior to last Congress, prior to President Trump being elected, it had only been used once in the entire decades that it's been on the books. And then it was used 16 times at the beginning of the Trump administration. And what makes it so it's both extremely effective and it's extremely blunt as an instrument, but it allows the House and the Senate to pass a resolution of disapproval that wipes a particular regulation off the books. It invalidates the whole rule. You can't just invalidate parts of a rule. And it then also prohibits agencies from promulgating a future rule in substantially the same form. And the rub is that the rule has to have gone final and been submitted to Congress and published in the Federal Register within 60 session days prior to it being taken up by the Senate. So 60 session days doesn't sound like a lot, but in 2017, we were actually able to go back all the way to May of the final year of the Obama administration and take up any of those rules that were deemed worth disapproving and disapproving them. Doug, why don't we go on to the next slide and bring up some specific examples?
So, as Mike says, it's a blunt instrument. There's no going back. to a regulation once it's turned into a verb, CRA'd. So, Mike, there are a couple of high-profile regulations that the Trump administration has issued, I think, within the 60-day look back. And some are more high-profile than others. The WOTUS bill, Waters of the U.S., the NEPA amendments, the cost-benefit risk rule for Clean Air Act regulations, the probably lesser known, some of the coal ash regulations. Which one of these regulations do you think are candidates for CRA treatment, and which ones probably aren't, and why?
Thanks, Doug. Because you are not able to, an agency is precluded from prospectively promulgating a substantially similar rule, that really narrows the field as to what people will want to use a Congressional Rule Act resolution to disapprove it for. So, for instance, there may be a lot of outrage in the environmental NGO community about the NEPA climate regs or the Waters of the United States reg. But the risk there is if you invalidate those rules, if somehow it gets over to the Senate and somehow a senator, because it's privileged, gets it up on the floor and gets a couple of Republicans to support it, and it passes, and President Biden signs that resolution of disapproval, you would not be able to regulate again in NEPA, and you would pretty much be locking in place those regulations from the 1970s, and I don't think that's what people want. So, Doug, I think stuff like the scientific transparency regulations, where the Trump administration was saying, hey, science that's relied upon for rulemakings must be publicly available, it must be peer-reviewed, which sounds very reasonable, but folks on the other side will say that's going to get rid of certain data sets that EPA has relied on for decades, and you're changing the rules midway as to what can be used for various rulemakings. I think they would gladly, at least in the House, they would pass a resolution of disapproval. Same thing, the cost-benefit rule for the Clean Air Act. I would say the Democrats in the House are adamant that the Clean Air Act should be a health-based set of standards, that cost-benefit should not enter into it. What should we be looking at is this a benefit to the public health, and do not take costs into this. So I think they would probably want to get rid of the cost-benefit rule for the Clean Air Act. And then it would go over to the Senate, where after certain steps have been taken and there's certain layover periods in committees, a single senator has a privileged ability to go to the Senate floor and bring up the resolution to disapproval and demand a vote on it. So like we said, it's a powerful tool, but its use can be kind of double-edged, so you really need to be careful.
And Mike, even with, before we go to climate change policies, even with assuming we're going to have a narrow Senate Republican majority, do you still see the potential, at least for rules like the cost-benefit rule under the Clean Air Act and the science rule, getting CRA'd? Is it possible that you could have some Republicans, if you need a majority in the Senate, crossing the aisle and voting with Democrats to CRA some of these?
Yeah, I think all of the senators that Art Stupak mentioned as possible candidates to vote in favor of something like this. But even if the Republicans hold and they're in the majority and thereby the resolution of disapproval is defeated, it is pretty attractive for a senator. You're taking control of the House floor away from the majority leader. You're calling a lot of attention. Probably there's been a big vote over in the House and committee work on the issue. So you're really highlighting whatever the particular regulation that you're trying to do away with, and kind of say how bad, remember how the Trump administration did this, and we would get rid of things like this but for our being in charge. So with narrow majorities, things can happen. So it's that'll be a fun thing to track over the next 6 to 9 months.
So Bart, with that, you want to, knowing that the CRA is still out there as an instrument, let's go back to climate change policies and what do you see going forward?
Well, as you and rest of the partners at Venable that are on this call, you were talking about the power of one senator can make a change. As long as the Senate remains in Republicans' hands, it's going to be very, very difficult to do any kind of climate crisis or climate change legislation, whatever you want to call it. It's very difficult politically and legislatively. And as I pointed out before, though, there's been a change in attitude in 2009 when we called climate change to 2021. Now as we're heading into, it's called climate crisis. When I look at it, like carbon pricing legislation, that's the old cap and trade we did in 2009. That was a very difficult vote for members, and myself included. It would be an easier vote now just because the climate has changed. Politically has changed, and I think we do see adverse effects on our climate, and climate change is going to be necessary. But again, it's going to be 100% clean energy economy by 2025. I find that difficult to achieve. So you're going to have to come up with other creative ways to do this. So you're going to look at your EPA and other agencies such as Interior, NOAA, Forest Service, Department of Energy, Ag, even Department of Defense. They will all have much more stricter policies to cut down on the global climate change that we see, and they'll be hidden in those pieces of legislation, and they'll come out of the House pretty aggressive, and I expect the Senate to roll back. Infrastructure legislation, a stimulus package, the highway bill, and it's been a number of years since we've done a true highway bill, where they used to be done every 5 years, and every 5 years to get members to vote on it, they used to put in what we called earmarks, and there's been a lot of discussion about putting earmarks in there. So if you have an aggressive infrastructure legislation, not only does it create jobs, but in there are going to be the new green jobs, as they call it, to get reluctant members to vote for it, do you put in an earmark or two so it's attractive, so you can justify that vote back home, wherever you're from, Michigan, Alabama, wherever. And then I would be, watch the international agreements. And the other place I think that we might see a lot of play on environment that's not talked about too much is financial services with Maxine Waters. In the campaign, you heard a little bit about the minority communities, climate justice for pollutants in communities of color and tribal lands, they call it, with 40% of all clean energy and infrastructure improvements or benefits, whatever you want to call it, would have to be in minority communities. There's no doubt in my mind Maxine Waters will insist upon that, but I also think Maxine will even go one further, that she will start saying, okay, banking, banking's international now, and so they're in banking. Are we going to have some global climate, environmental standards put into the banking bills, banking laws? Are other countries going to require us to do so? Maxine Waters and that Financial Services Committee, it's the old banking committee, if you will, but it's going to be more than just banking, more than just financial services. You're going to see a lot of environmental policies, and those policies will be put into, I think, international agreements. Loans of any significance will probably require you to have some global legislation in there. And then look at legislation to help the EPA have more tougher, stronger enforcement laws on all aspects of it. Underneath the Trump administration, EPA has sort of been dialed back. Look for that to be energized greatly. And with Raul Grijalva, head of the Interior Committee in the House, and he's a very, very progressive member out of New Mexico, you will see greater environmental impact and greater emphasis on environmental enforcement through that committee. And I know there's so much work to talk about, so I'm going to throw it back to Mike, because there's other things, environmental justice and other things we've been talking about. Mike, you want to take it?
Sure. Thanks, Bart. So I don't think we can emphasize enough how environmental justice, just like climate change, will be something that's spread throughout the entire government. I think it's going to be a lens with which agency decision-making and all the environment and natural resources agencies peer through, and it'll lead to, I think, increased enforcement for fence line communities. But I think it also affect decision making, grants, any place where there's enough discretionary room for the agencies to lean into environmental justice, they will. Infrastructure legislation coming up, I think there's a lot of recognition that there's a big need out there for safe drinking water infrastructure, and that you may see some reforms that accompany that. I think there's bipartisan support for phasing out HFCs, for banning asbestos, for doing the every 5-year pipeline safety bill. I doubt a Superfund tax is going to get through the Congress this year, just the tight margins and stuff. But I think that's been a Democratic priority to refund the CIRCLE program. I would also think there's going to be and the Biden campaign has emphasized, they think the Trump administration has really dropped the ball on biodiversity protections. So I think both Marine Mammal Protection Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and of course the Endangered Species Act will receive vigorous implementation under a Biden administration. And then generally, I think where they're able to, even without Congress's help, the administration's going to use permitting standards, regulatory approvals and say in the SEC world, disclosures to discourage the production and exploration of fossil fuels and especially fracking. Doug, I think we're back to you.
Great. Well, thank you all. A couple things first. If you do have questions, please use your chat box. You can submit them to us, and we'll try to respond to them. We do have a question we want to respond to, but before we do that, I want to remind folks of the CLE code for this webinar, and the CLE word is Environment 2020. So Environment 2020 is the CLE code. One of the questions we did get, and Bart touched on this, but I know, Nick, I think you can also respond, is what will the Biden administration do with respect in the environmental space with respect to financial services? How, Bart mentioned we might see it with Representative Waters leading the way, but do we see, how do you see that being factored in by the Biden administration to incorporate environmental policy in the financial services world?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. You're right. Bart and Mike both did touch on this a little bit. I think if we were sitting here today in a world where we, knew or at least thought Democrats were going to hold the majority in the Senate, I think we would probably be saying we should expect fairly aggressive legislation and regulation in the financial services sector as relates to climate and any number of other things. The fact that Republicans seem likely to hold the Senate, I think, is a variable that is going to be a little bit of a limiting factor even on the regulatory front. Certainly the Biden administration is going to apply a climate and environmental justice lens to any aspect of government that they reasonably can. Things we don't typically think of in that space, like housing and agriculture, and certainly financial services, I think falls into that bucket. The limiting factor, I think, there, and why it's still to me a very big question mark, is if Republicans hold the Senate, and that seems likely, it's going to come down to what administrative nominees can get through the Senate. And when you're talking the financial regulators, I would expect these issues to be brought up during confirmation hearings, and Republican senators in particular, trying to extract commitments from Biden's nominees on some of these things. particularly as to what they're not willing to do. Again, we'll know a little more once those Georgia special elections are settled, but I think Republicans holding the Senate is going to be a limiting factor in some ways on that.
Okay, well, thanks, Nick. We have a couple of CRA questions coming in, and obviously that's on a lot of people's minds. And one is, what do we see? Do we see it likely that Congress will try to reverse the changes to the Council on Environmental Quality, the White House CEQ regulations, under CRA? Will that be a priority to the new administration? And if so, how is that likely to be done, and the time frame for doing that? And if it's not done through CRA, how will it be done? Mike, do you want to take that? And I'm going to move these slides up, folks, back to the questions, the last slide, back to the question slide. Mike, you want to take a shot at that?
There we go.
CRA
Sorry,
question?
I was on mute. Thanks, Doug. Yes. Well, I think it will be, although Congress would I'm sure, like to maybe weigh in or directly challenge some of the NEPA rules. I think that's going to be tough in divided government. So it'd be up to the administration. And one thing I think there has been some criticism of the Trump administration for moving quickly, but maybe not as carefully as they could have early in the Trump administration in terms of their trying to change Obama-era rules. I think Mary Newmeyer, who is the director of CEQ, was the complete opposite, and she was deliberate and careful, and they spent years working on that package in order to make it as solid as possible and bulletproof from legal challenges they could. So that would lead the administration to go through, start again, finding the rationale for why they, thoughtfully and carefully need to revise these regs so soon after they were done, to try to do it in a way that is not viewed as arbitrary and capricious and that is legally defensible. And that takes building a record, that takes going through the entire APA rulemaking process, and that makes it take time and be very formidable. Does that square with what you're thinking, Doug?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is right. And we have a couple more questions that kind of dance around that, not so much CRA related, but how would the Biden administration react to some of the Trump administration regulations? And one we got, and this is a great question, which is, do we think that the recent WOTUS, navigable waters rule, will be implemented under the Biden administration, or will it be rolled back to the previous rule? And as right now, that rule is subject to litigation in various federal district courts across the country. And it's, as Mike mentioned, it will be interesting to see what the Biden Justice Department does eventually in defending that rule. Will it take a step back and say, let's take this one back, let's reevaluate it, like the Trump administration did with respect to defending some of the Obama-era regulations that were in litigation during that transition period? If irrespective of how that rule comes out with litigation, I think what the Biden administration learned from what happened in the Trump administration in the early 6 to 12 months, and I think they know it already, is you just can't reverse a rule. You have to go through notice and comment rulemaking. There has to be a reasoned basis for it. And so irrespective of how the Biden administration, how the Justice Department on behalf of the EPA defends or takes a more tepid approach with respect to the litigation on the WOTUS rule, I think it's fair to say that they will be reevaluating it, but if they're going to change it, it's probably going to take compliance, or will take compliance with the APA, notice and comment rulemaking, and a reasoned basis for any new regulation. Nick, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, but it's a great question, and it's one that we've been thinking about internally about what's going to happen to the WOTUS litigation. But I think that litigation's out there, it's on, and we just have to see how the new Justice Department under the Biden administration, whether it takes a more tepid approach in its defense. But ultimately, I think we can see a new round of rulemaking there.
Yeah, I think you covered that well, Doug. I don't have anything to add.
I think the last question we have is how important will enforcement be for the Biden administration to reverse Trump policies immediately without new rules or laws? Well, a lot doesn't have to change with respect to new rules or laws. The rules and laws are on the books. It depends on the appetite for enforcement under the new administration. The current administration approach with respect to enforcement has been one of focusing on compliance assistance, focusing on compliance assistance and saying that will bring about, and that's just as effective a tool to ensure compliance. A carrot's as good as a stick. I think the Biden administration is going to use a little bit more of a stick approach. But having said that, and by that I mean enforcing current regulations and rules, there are some executive orders that have come out of the White House that has kind of under the radar in the last 3 months with respect to directing federal agencies to defer when possible, seeking penalties in administrative enforcement in order to promote economic recovery. I wouldn't be surprised to see that order reversed. But I don't think there have to be major changes in rules or regulations to increase enforcement under the Biden administration. It's simply using a heavier stick to enforce existing regulations and laws. Let me just see if we have any other questions here. And the last one we have, I believe, is it likely, and I'm again watching our time here, is it likely that any of the litany of cases currently against the CEQ rule will succeed, or will the Biden administration decide not to defend the rule and would it potentially get it invalidated that way? Again, it's hard to say until we see what the new administration position it is with respect to litigation concerning regulations that it's not in favor of. But we did see, if we take precedent as an example, the Trump administration taking that approach in 2017 in determining not to defend certain rules, taking them back, taking voluntary remands back, and repromulgating the rules in a way that the administration found were more consistent with its policy. So with respect to the CEQ rules, just like the NEPA rules, with the WOTUS rules, I think it's too early to tell, but that's clearly an option that the new administration has. Let's take a step back from defense, let's take voluntary remands, and let's reevaluate this regulation and whether we got to engage in and determine whether to engage in a new round of notice and comment rulemaking.
And Doug, this is Mike. In the case of the Affordable Care Act, so that's not environment but healthcare, but the Trump administration switched sides. I mean, it was that much of a 180 in terms of where they stood. So,
one other question that. How do we think the new administration will influence, if at all, the new USAC and national, the NWPS? I don't know whether anybody has a reaction to that. I am not certain, but whether any other folks, any of my colleagues on the phone have a reaction to the last question. Let us think about that. And as we said at the beginning, or if we didn't, I'll say it now, we have all these questions, and if we have further thoughts, we can come back and get back to that, the person who posed the question. All right, well, seeing no further questions, I want to thank everyone again for joining us for this post-election webinar on environmental policy. I think, as you can see, a lot of things are still in flux, but one thing we know is not in flux is we're going to see a lot of change going forward. So with that, I'll remind folks of what the CLE code is again, Environment 2020. Any other closing messages from the other folks on the line? Mike, Bart, Nick, Will?
No, it was fun.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Stay well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.